So imagine a government that just regulates absolutely everything, like from the exact price of grain in the marketplace all the way to the covert activities of its foreign spies.
Oh, yeah. And running these complex, multi-decade disinformation campaigns to destabilize rival nations.
Right, and doing all of this without ever officially declaring war. I mean, it sounds like a textbook description of a modern superpower operating in our current era of geopolitics.
You definitely think so. But try ancient India, roughly 2,000 years ago.
It's crazy.
It completely upends the popular imagination, doesn't it? Because when most people picture the ancient Indian subcontinent, the aesthetic is heavily skewed toward mysticism.
Yeah, you think of sages meditating in quiet forests.
Exactly. You think of the pursuit of spiritual enlightenment, the origins of yoga. It's a landscape defined almost entirely by peace and metaphysical philosophy.
And to be fair, those spiritual dimensions are undeniably real and they're profoundly important, but they have created this massive blind spot for us.
They really have.
So our mission for this deep dive today is to look at a really fascinating collection of essays specifically centered around a piece titled The Forgotten Strategic Wisdom of Ancient Indian Statecraft. And we're going to absolutely shatter that peaceful, idealized illusion.
We really are.
Because we're going to uncover how ancient India was, in reality, one of the most sophisticated, relentlessly calculating, and strategically advanced civilizations in human history.
And, to understand why they had to be so calculating, you just have to look at the map.
Right.
A civilization as vast, as diverse, and frankly, as geographically exposed as ancient India could never have survived purely on idealism. I mean, you simply cannot meditate away a hostile invading army that wants your resources.
No, definitely not.
So survival in that specific environment required raw power and immense organizational capability. The thinkers of that era understood a terrifying reality, which is that without security, civilization just collapses into chaos.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit, because when we talk about ancient Indian philosophy, the word dharma always comes up. And people usually translate it as a sort of cosmic moral order or religious duty. It sounds very elevated and very peaceful. But the essays we are looking at frame it very differently. They argue these rulers weren't just debating philosophy, they were absolute realists.
They were realists because they completely understood the alternative to dharma. They had this concept called Matsya. Yeah, which translates roughly to the law of the fish.
Right.
And the idea is, in a trout, when the water evaporates, the big fish eat the small fish.
Wow, that's bleak.
It's very bleak. But that was their baseline view of nature and international relations. The strong devour the weak, period. So Dharma wasn't just about personal morality.
It was something bigger.
Exactly. It was the structural dam that kept the water level high enough so the small fish could survive. But to build and maintain that dam, the state needed to stick. It needed military force, economic leverage, and honestly, the willingness to use violence to maintain order.
Which means the rulers of these ancient empires had a very rigorous, very concrete checklist to keep that law of the fish at bay.
Oh, absolutely.
Like they had to protect trade routes, maintain elite military units, prevent internal fragmentation.
Manage temporary alliances.
Yeah, and neutralize threats before they even materialized. And the ultimate masterclass in this is a text called the Arthashastra.
Yes.
Now, you often hear it compared to Machiavelli's The Prince. But reading through the details from these sources, that comparison feels way too small to me.
I agree completely.
Like, if The Prince is a manual for a single CEO trying to keep their job and outmaneuver their rivals, the Arthashastra sounds more like a complete operating system for an entire multinational corporation.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's an incomplete comparison to just look at Machiavelli. Because The Prince is highly focused on the individual ruler's survival, right?
Right.
The Arthashastra assumes the individual is replaceable. It is the machinery of the state itself that must survive.
Wow.
It's an operating system built under the assumption that the network is under constant, relentless cyber attack. It didn't just tell a king how to be ruthless. It detailed standard operating procedures for forestry, mining, taxation, urban planning.
Literally everything.
Literally everything. Because it recognized that national power isn't just having a massive army. I mean, if your agricultural tax base fails, your treasury empties.
Right.
If your treasury empties, your army mutinies. So power is the synthesis of economic stability, administrative efficiency, and diplomatic positioning.
So if the Arthashastra is this highly efficient operating system managing the internal state, it naturally has to map the network it's connected to.
Has to process the external environment.
Exactly. So how did these ancient strategists view the world map? Because, spoiler alert for you listening, they did not assume their neighbors wanted to sing campfire songs.
No, definitely not. Their foundational assumption was that neighboring states inherently compete. Right. It wasn't a question of if a neighbor would attack, but when the conditions would be optimal for them to do so. They believed that weakness always invites aggression.
And they mapped this out formally, didn't they?
You did, in something called the mandala theory.
Right. And the core concept of the mandala theory is just both brilliantly simple and totally ruthless.
It really is.
The theory states that your immediate neighbor is inherently your competitor, but your neighbor's neighbor. That is a natural strategic partner because you both share the same competitor in the middle.
Yeah, think of it like a set of geopolitical gears. If you are a gear and your neighbor is a gear connected to you, any movement they make causes friction against you.
Because you share a border.
Exactly. You share a border, you are inevitably going to compete for the same river system, the same fertile valleys, the same trade access. Border friction is just a physical reality. But the gear on the other side of your neighbor, when your neighbor turns against you, they are simultaneously turning against that third state. So your movement and that third state's movement are naturally aligned.
Okay, but does this mean they were just trapped in a state of constant paranoia? I mean, if your neighbors are always enemies and alliances are just temporary conveniences based on border geography, isn't there any room for permanent trust in this worldview? Because that sounds exhausting.
It does sound exhausting, but what's fascinating here is that we shouldn't view it as paranoia. The sources point out it was calculated adaptation to a structural reality.
Oh, okay.
Strategy required total flexibility. If you develop a rigid emotional attachment to another nation, like believing they are your permanent friend, you lose the ability to adapt when their interests inevitably shift.
Yes, they always will shift.
Exactly. And if we look at modern international relations, it operates on these exact same geopolitical gears. When we talk about the balance of power, or states forming balancing coalitions, or regional powers seeking counterweights,
We are literally describing the mandala theory.
we really are. Strategic alignments today constantly shift based on national interests, not sentimentality.
So if the world is this grinding set of geopolitical gears and alliances are always shifting, you can't survive if you're flying blind. You need data.
You absolutely do.
You have to know when a gear is preparing to turn before it actually moves. Which brings us perfectly to their absolute obsession with intelligence gathering. For ancient Indian rulers, information wasn't just a byproduct of governance, it was the foundation of survival.
Oh, the intelligence apparatus described in these texts is staggering in its depth. Like, we aren't just talking about a few battlefield scouts reporting on troop movements.
No.
We're talking about deeply embedded, layered systems of covert operatives. Spies disguised as merchants, ascetics, bakers, wandering monks.
Double agents.
Yes, double agents. Intelligence was woven into the absolute fabric of daily life.
Right, because they understood that wars are rarely decided on the battlefield. They're decided in the months and years beforehand. A ruler who has superior information has a massive strategic advantage.
While a ruler blinded by ignorance is basically already a casualty, I don't care how many war elephants they have.
Exactly. But what really stood out to me from the essays was what they were looking for. They weren't just monitoring foreign armies. They were hunting for economic instability, elite corruption, and internal fragmentation.
Because the law of the fish applies internally too. Yeah, these ancient thinkers explicitly warned that civilizations almost always weaken from the inside before an external power can dominate them.
That is so relevant.
It is. National security wasn't just about putting guards on the border wall. It was about maintaining societal cohesion. If a ruler loses legitimacy, or if factions within the elite become polarized, society fragments.
And here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. As you read the mechanics of how they exploited this fragmentation in rival states, it sounds exactly like modern hybrid warfare.
Oh, down to the letter.
Like, if they identified a rival kingdom where the elites were divided, they didn't send troops. They sent infiltrators to spread rumors, forge documents, and amplify the division.
They were running sophisticated influence campaigns.
Yes. Disinformation networks thousands of years before the internet.
Which raises an important question about what a battlefield actually is. In this framework, perception itself is a theater of war.
Wow.
Yeah. If a foreign power can manipulate the perceptions of your citizens, stoke existing grievances, and cause your society to tear itself apart, they don't need to endure the cost of a military invasion.
They can just wait for you to collapse.
Exactly. They wait, walk in, and absorb your resources.
Yeah.
The ancients understood that a divided society is a highly manipulable society.
It makes you think deeply about how we consume information and handle polarization today, honestly.
It really does.
But let's flip the script a bit. If a state successfully locked down its internal cohesion, stopped disinformation, and secured its borders, how did it project its own power outward? Like, once you're secure, what is the next move? And the ancient Indian strategy bridges this gap by moving from hard intelligence to economics and the mechanics of civilizational influence.
Yeah, and this is crucial because modern policy often treats the economy and national defense as two separate cabinet departments.
Right, totally separate.
But ancient Indian strategy viewed them as the exact same organ. Economic strength was the literal mechanism of state power.
Makes sense.
If you don't have prosperity, your institutions decay. Your people become susceptible to those foreign influence campaigns we just discussed, and you fall.
So they invested heavily.
Heavily. Rulers invested massive state resources into agriculture, complex taxation infrastructures, and trade regulation. Trade wasn't just merchants trying to get rich. Trade was the state's geopolitical reach.
And you cannot talk about ancient Indian trade without looking at the oceans. The maritime focus is incredible in these texts. The Indian Ocean trade routes linked the subcontinent to Southeast Asia, Arabia, and the East African coast.
It was a massive network.
Yeah, they didn't view the ocean as the watery edge of their kingdom. They viewed it as a superhighway where they could establish absolute centrality. Ports and sea lanes were highly strategic assets.
And the merchants, diplomats, and scholars traveling these routes ended up shaping global geopolitics for centuries.
And we have to look at how they shaped it, because it wasn't through brute force, right?
No, not at all. In the days of sail, maritime trade was entirely dictated by monsoon wind patterns. You didn't just quickly sail across the Bay of Bengal and sail right back.
Right.
The winds would carry merchants to Southeast Asia, and then they would be physically stuck there for months waiting for the winds to shift back.
So they weren't just dropping off cargo, they were living there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Over those months, they set up communities, they intermarried, they built temples, they shared their literature, but it went deeper than cultural exchange.
How so?
Well, local chiefs and emerging kings in Southeast Asia looked at these highly organized, wealthy Indian merchants and realized, we need that operating system. So, to legitimize their own rule, these Southeast Asian leaders voluntarily imported Indian administrative frameworks, legal codes, and scholars.
That is wild. I mean, it's like a developing company deciding they want to upgrade from paper ledgers, so they voluntarily install the entire Microsoft software suite, and suddenly they are locked into that ecosystem.
That's a brilliant analogy.
Well, the essays note this phenomenon led to the rise of Indianized kingdoms across Southeast Asia. They adopted the philosophy, the language, the architecture, and governance structures, but without a single Indian empire sending a conquering army.
Not one.
So how does civilizational attraction actually work as a defense strategy?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it is soft power operating on a civilizational scale before the term ever existed. Ideas and administrative systems shape geopolitical space just as effectively as weapons.
Right.
When another region adopts your cultural prestige, your language, or your legal frameworks, it creates an enormous baseline of trust. Economic interaction reinforces that trust, and shared intellectual frameworks deepen political alignment.
So you're building a buffer.
You essentially create a massive interconnected buffer zone of friendly states that rely on your economic and cultural ecosystem to function.
And if they rely on your ecosystem, they are highly unlikely to align with your enemies.
Precisely. And look at how global power is projected today. We see this exact logic with global supply chains, the race to control semiconductor manufacturing, and the competition over technological standards like 5G.
Wow, yeah.
When nations share technological frameworks and are economically interdependent, it generates massive strategic leverage. Ancient strategists understood the mechanics of this perfectly. They just used monsoon trade routes, Sanskrit, and philosophical frameworks instead of microchips and data cables.
It is incredible to see the mechanics of history repeating itself so clearly.
Right.
Okay, let's pull all of these threads together, because the core takeaway from diving into these essays is that ancient Indian statecraft demands a total reevaluation of how we view that civilization.
It really does.
They teach us that societies only survive through a necessary, highly calculated combination of moral vision, that dharma, and raw strategic capability. You need the ideals to give society a purpose, but you absolutely must have the power, the intelligence networks, and the economic leverage to protect those ideals from the law of the fish.
And it is vital to realize this isn't just an academic history lesson.
No.
As we watch naval competition heat up in the Indo-Pacific today, with modern superpowers maneuvering for control over those exact same sea lanes, ports, and maritime choke points, we are not witnessing a new global reality.
We're watching the return of a very old one.
Yes. The Indo-Pacific has been a theater of intense, calculating strategic competition for millennia.
So what does this all mean for us today? Like, what is the ultimate so what that we should take away from uncovering this forgotten wisdom?
Well, the essays outline what they call the Strategic Vanguard take, and it serves as a stark warning. I should note we're just reporting what the source argues here, but the argument is that modern societies, and specifically modern India, must consciously rediscover this kind of strategic confidence.
Right.
Because for a long time, there's been a partial forgetting of this ruthless, calculating heritage in favor of the purely spiritual interpretation. But in a world that is rapidly returning to great power rivalry, cutthroat economic competition, and relentless information warfare, intellectual dependency is incredibly dangerous.
How so?
If a civilization forgets the enduring strategic principles of its own history and relies only on borrowed frameworks or imported political theories, that intellectual dependency eventually produces strategic dependency. To navigate a future filled with competitors, you have to understand how your own ancestors survived the exact same game.
That is a powerful warning about the necessity of owning your own strategic history, and it brings me to a final lingering thought for you to take away from this deep dive.
Oh, definitely.
As you read through the source text, there is a recurring emphasis on the concept of strategic patience. These ancient strategists didn't just plan for the next quarter, they planned across entire generations.
They really did.
They prioritized calculated restraint, gradual economic consolidation, and long-term institutional resilience over immediate emotional retaliation. Not every provocation required an instant reaction. Sometimes the ultimate victory was simply absorbing the shock, enduring, and outlasting the opponent.
Right.
So as you look at our modern world today, a world completely consumed by 24-hour news cycles, the constant immediate outrage of social media, and the relentless demand from the public for instant reactions to every single geopolitical event, you have to wonder, has our modern obsession with speed actually stripped us of our strategic capability to survive?
It's a great question.
We started this deep dive by asking you to picture the ancient Indian sages meditating in the quiet forests. We wanted to shatter that peaceful illusion to show you the calculated, ruthless reality beneath it. But maybe in a world that never stops rushing and reacting, wait, let me rephrase that. In a world that never stops rushing and reacting, that ability to sit still, to remain patient, and to think generations ahead, maybe that was their greatest strategic weapon all along.
Thank you for joining us on this Strategic Vanguard podcast. If you found value in this analysis, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you fresh podcasts every Monday here on YouTube and Rumble, and you can also catch the audio versions on Spotify and Amazon Music. Just search for Strategic Vanguard Podcast. For more insights, articles, and discussions, subscribe to our blog at strategicvanguard.com. Your support helps us grow and bring you more in-depth analysis on defense, geopolitics, and strategy. Until next time, stay informed, stay strategic.